Yesterday, all of Dark Neostorm actually got leaked, all the new cards, all the imports, all the rarities, very exciting stuff, and I'm sure you've already seen some discussions already, even though it's only been like 24 hours, about the new hand trap, the 000 spot in the set, and I'm going to talk about it in today's video because oh my gosh is this card insane, and I think it's a really good step in the right direction, and also it's a little surprising to me because this card actually sounds very familiar. It reminds me of some of the cards that we read about in the next Megatins. Remember that Konami sort of hinted at 3 new world premiere cards. This kind of sounds along the same lines as those, which means that Konami really does want to take Yu-Gi-Oh back into a situation where players feel more in control throughout their games, make it a little bit more fair when you go second, and I think this is an awesome decision on Konami's part. I am a little bit disappointed that we keep getting these bad world premieres. I mean, don't get me wrong, this card's insane. There's another really cool like trap card that's released that maybe I'll talk about at the end of the video or in a different video. But to be completely honest, I'm a little bit disappointed in not only the world premiere cards in this set, Dark Neostorm, but also in the last set. If you remember the last set as well as this one, we're getting a whole bunch of just filler cards. And I think the reason this is happening, by the way, is because Konami realized that danger monsters were way too powerful, so they had to sort of replace them with something. Remember last set we got the Time Thieves, which apparently we're not getting any more of, despite the fact that the archetype was barely an archetype to begin with. You only had a couple cards, and while Time Thief Redoer is really good in the different rank up magic strategies, overall the archetype isn't really doing anything. It did have some promise, but it looks like Konami just doesn't want to support it anymore. Kind of a weird decision. But in this set we're getting a whole bunch of Valkyrie cards. I get it, people are excited about Valkyries. They got a whole bunch of support in a recent set, and then they got some support in the last set, but overall I mean Valkyries are just more of a casual strategy, and it seems kind of weird to me that they've sort of shifted the focus of these world premiere cards. I mean they've changed it up a little bit over this past year. They seem to be a lot less consistent with their numbers as compared to last year's, where we knew that you were getting 4 Burning Abyss monsters or 4 Kaiju cards, stuff like that, where this year it seems like they're changing it like every single set. But this time around we just got a whole bunch of Valkyrie cards, and I mean Valkyries are cool for people that like them, but for a lot of us who just want more competitive cards, maybe more answers to the metagame perhaps, but at least they're giving us this really awesome hand trap. As to be expected, this new hand trap is a secret rare card, so it'll probably be pretty expensive, especially considering how powerful it is. Its name as of right now, at least the German translation I believe, is No Material, and that is a hilarious pun. I really hope that it carries over into the English translation. I'm almost positive that it will because it just makes sense in both languages. This is a level 1 Earth Fairy effect monster, 0 attack, 1000 defense, not a tuner monster. That's a pretty big deal for a lot of people. This is not a tuner. It can be used for link summons. I mean obviously you can use it for Link Kribo in a pinch, but overall I think you're just trying to use it as a hand trap. And this card's effect says as follows: if your opponent special summons a monster or monsters while you control no cards, you can discard this card, then target one face-up monster your opponent controls. This turn, that monster cannot be tributed or used as material for fusion, synchro, exceeds, or link summon. You can only use its effects of no material once per turn. Now that is a lot to unpack. There are a lot of cards that this works really well against, but there's also a lot of cards that you wouldn't really want to play in the same deck as this, and I think that makes a very interesting deck building decision. But what does this card really accomplish? Well, it accomplishes basically telling your opponent, here's one monster on your side of the field that I don't want you doing anything with for the rest of the turn. It pretty much locks it out of everything, right? You can't tribute it, you can't use it for any sort of extra deck summon, and that pretty much means your opponent is stuck with it until their next turn, where hopefully they can get rid of it, or at least from their perspective, hopefully they can get rid of it. But I think in many cases the card won't even live that long because you'll probably deal with it on your own turn. Now where does this come up? Well, it comes up in a lot of matchups. If we just look at the 3 most popular matchups right now, Salamangreats, Sky Strikers, and Thunder Dragons, this card has unique applications against all 3 of those decks, and it's especially deadly against Salamangreats and Thunder Dragons. A lot of people might use this to stop Gazelle from your opponent actually using that for material. Usually that Gazelle gets used for Mirage Stelio, sometimes it gets used for Sunlight Wolf. By using no material on the Gazelle, it not only ensures that your opponent can't make a Mirage Stelio, it also prevents your opponent from recycling the Gazelle with the Sunlight Wolf to continue their play on the next turn. But maybe you don't care about the Gazelle, maybe you don't care about the Mirage Stelio. In that case, you could save this card until the first Sunlight Wolf is summoned, and that really stops your opponent, because if you use this on that first Sunlight Wolf, it prevents your opponent from using their field spell to reincarnate Link Summon into the second Sunlight Wolf, which means that your opponent can't add the Roar back to their hand, and that is a big deal when you're playing against Salamangreats because Roar is really their only interruption on the first turn when you go second. Of course, they might have some hand traps that you'll still have to deal with, but stopping your opponent from adding back that Roar is huge, and also you just leave them with an 1800 attack monster that's not Reincarnation Link summon, so if they happen to draw the Rage, now that card is a lot less impactful. Against Thunder Dragons, you can put them in a ton of awkward situations. Namely, I think this card is fantastic against either of the baby Chaos Dragons. Those are like the main cards for that deck right now. They facilitate many different banishing plays by banishing your Thunder Dragons and triggering those effects, but also they facilitate all those Guard Dragon combos, those crazy combos that Thunder Dragons are sort of known for at this point, and by using no material on one of those mini Chaos Dragons, it effectively turns off their Guard Dragon combos for the entire turn. Keep in mind that with those baby Chaos Dragons, you can only summon one with each name once per turn. That's a big deal because it means if your opponent summons the light one and then you use no material, suddenly they can't summon any more copies of that. They can't get rid of that one for a Guard Dragon, and also if they didn't hard draw the Collapse Serpent, they can't summon that one either because they have no way of getting the Y-Reverser into the graveyard in the first place to trigger that effect. It's probably the least efficient against Skyswagers. It still has some applications, but realistically you're not really playing it against that matchup. The reasons that you wouldn't play it is because if you use it on Ray, your opponent can just chain the effect and then they just summon a Link monster anyway, and even if you manage to use it on a Link monster, which might seem good in a simplified game state, if they have either multi-roll or the field spell or terraforming or a way to search either of those cards, they can just send a Link monster to the graveyard. It might slow them down a little bit, it might make them make one awkward search, but overall I don't think that no material is the best card to use against Skyswagers. Maybe if you're main decking it, you can get some sort of interesting plays off, but in general you're not really using it against that deck in most scenarios. Another more generic situation where I really like this card, and I think a lot of people will see use out of it, is if your opponent summons a monster with link arrows that don't point down, if you use no material on it, it locks them out of summoning any monsters from the extra deck for the rest of the turn, unless they have a way to get rid of that link monster. A classic example of this is if your opponent summons Nightmare Phoenix, pops your back row, after that back row is destroyed, if that was your last card, you can use the no material on the Nightmare Phoenix, and now your opponent basically can't link someone unless they have a way to get that off the field immediately. In other words, where this card shines is when your opponent is trying to use a specific monster for a specific link monster to trigger a graveyard effect, or if they're trying to summon a link 1 monster and they only have one monster on the field. But enough about the positives, let's talk a little bit about the negatives too. For example, and this might seem obvious, but this card is really bad going first. It's actually useless if you set up even a single card on the board, and that's a pretty big deal because while it is true that hand traps are better when you're going second than when you're going first, and while it is true that many people do side out their hand traps when they know they're going first in games 2 or 3, what makes this card different from a lot of the other hand traps out there, pretty much every other hand trap out there, is that it's completely useless if there's even a single card on your side of the field. The only comparable card to that is something like Infinite Impermanence if we're talking about hand traps, but in the case of Infinite Impermanence, if you go first or if you're later in the game, you can just set the card as a normal back row. Other things like Ash Blossom or Ghost Ogre or Effectville or DD Crow, all those cards don't really care how many cards are on the board, you can still activate them, which means that this card is extremely bad going first. It's a card you only want going second. Does that mean that people will main deck it? I'm not entirely sure. Its effect is very powerful, but if you draw it when you go first, especially if you draw it in multiples, you're basically playing with blank cards in your hand that you most likely will not be able to activate any point in that game. Another card this has sort of negative synergy with is Phantasme. Now I know that people play Phantasme and Infinite Impermanence in the same decks, but still in both those cases you can draw those cards when you go first and it's not the worst thing in the world. However, in the case of Phantasme, Infinite Impermanence, and no material, you're really looking at a lot of cards that you can't activate at the same time. If you draw a hand of Phantasme, Infinite Impermanence, and no material, you're looking at a situation where yeah, you can activate the Impermanence and the no material before your opponent actually gives you an opportunity to summon the Phantasme, but in a lot of cases you might just want to summon Phantasme immediately to fix your hand, and then you almost certainly have to put back those 2 cards because you no longer can use them. It's a really weird situation when you put a very powerful stun effect on a hand trap, but really make it so you can only use it very specifically when you go second and don't open Phantasme. Admittedly, I still think this card is so powerful that people might, especially in games 2 or 3 when they know they're going second, they might actually keep Infinite Impermanence, Phantasme, and No Material in their deck, just so that they hopefully draw any one of those to deal with whatever their opponent is throwing at them on turn 1. Of course, I might be wrong, this card might be terrible, but at least for the first couple weeks of Dark Neostorm, I would definitely expect to go up against this deck if you're going first in games 2 or 3. There is so much hype surrounding this card that it's almost impossible for it to not see some experimentation, despite the fact that it has negative synergy with cards like Phantasme and sort of follows the same issues as Infinite Impermanence. I think this card will still be very powerful and very popular for at least the first couple weeks. After that, we'll have to wait and see. It is interesting to note this is another huge departure from the OCG ban list or the OCG card pool. When you look at a lot of their decks and their format, you have to consider that they have 3 copies of Maxx C. If this card is as influential as I think it might be, you'll suddenly have to compare the TCG players with No Material to the OCG players with Maxx C. It could create 2 very different metagames, even if we eventually get to sort of similar card pools. Anyway though, hope you guys enjoyed today's discussion video on this new World Premiere card. I'll probably talk about a couple of the other cards. I think the Skull-Dread Trap is pretty interesting. I'll try to fit that into a discussion later on this week. I'll see you guys later though. Thank you so much for watching today's video. Goodbye.